Good morning, everybody, both with us here at Atticus HQ in Millbank in Westminster, and those joining online, either live or watching the repeat. We will be taking questions live in the room, or if you're watching online, please do submit the questions to us, and we will come to them in due course, either in response of what you hear today or with questions that you want answered. This is the latest session in our Atticus Ask series of meetings with senior politicians, ministers and shadow ministers. And today we're delighted to be joined by Labour's James Murray, Member of Parliament. James is Labour MP for Ealing and Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Prior to becoming an MP, James was Deputy Mayor for London with responsibility for housing under London's Mayor Sadiq Khan. His current brief includes responsibility for public expenditure in a role shadowing what is widely seen as the second most senior role in the Treasury. No pressure. In this Parliament, his work has included overseeing Labour's position on the National Insurance Contributions Bill, the Finance Bill and infrastructure, including the UK Infrastructure Bank Bill, which we may come to. James, welcome to Atticus.
Thanks for having me.
Look, we meet in serious times. Inflation is soaring, interest rates are rocketing, public services are buckling. We're post-Brexit, post-COVID, and I'm sure you, as I do, as a Labour parliamentary candidate, hope we'll soon be post-Conservative government. Wages have gone up, it's been announced, but unemployment is also up at 4%, whilst employers have gaps that they need to fill. It's a strange and serious time indeed. You're in a position, as we hope, to give us real insights into Labour's preparation for government and Labour's answers to the problems that we're facing. My first question that we received, actually different versions of, but quite repeated throughout those submitting, is the Labour Party ready to govern?
Yes.
Okay, question two.
Next question. No, I think we're ready. We want a general election as soon as it can possibly come, because frankly, I think the country needs a general election because the country needs a new government. We've had 13 years now of the Conservatives, and when you see Conservative ministers speaking about the difficulties we're facing, they quite often refer to COVID or what's happening in Ukraine or Brexit, and they talk about the issues which have happened recently. But the truth is that when you think about COVID and the war in Ukraine, that's affecting all countries around the world. Why are we so much more badly affected than so many other countries and around the world? And the truth is that we went into a lot of the difficulties recently with a weaker economy, with less secure public services, and with greater underlying difficulties within our economy. And that's really a lack of preparation from the Conservatives, a lack of security in our economy and our society. And that's really one of the reasons why Rachel Reeves has set out her vision for the economy, which is based on securonomics, which is putting security at the heart of our economic approach, making sure that families have that security in their homes, in their workplace, in their energy bills, and people can actually plan for the future. It also really applies to businesses, I think, because one of the things which really strikes me is that when I've been going around over the last few years speaking to businesses about what they're looking for in a government and their frustrations with the current government, one thing they always say to me is they want stability. They want a bit of certainty, and they want to know what's going to happen in terms of the regulatory environment or the tax rates, or what the government's strategy is on various different sectors of the economy, so they can make those decisions about investment. So if we had Rachel Reeves in number 11, if we had a Labour government, that security, that stability, that absolute dedication to the fiscal rules which Rachel has set out would underpin everything that we do.
That's terrific. I guess on the doorstep, people, and there are now 5 by-elections, people are expecting to hear from Labour more. Do you know what you're going to do in the first 100 days and just not telling people?
But when you say 5, has Nadine Dorries actually resigned yet?
This is true. This is true. We're on Nadine watch. Yeah, it may break as we're live.
Look, I mean, what we need to do is make sure that we're campaigning for every vote. I'm spending a lot of time in Uxbridge and South Ruislip at the moment. It's my neighbouring constituency. It's obviously, we want to make sure we win there. We've got Danny Beales, who's a fantastic candidate there. I'm out there campaigning because we know we can't take anything for granted. And I think when people talk to me and my colleagues about the polls and about what might happen in the next general election, I think it just makes us feel even more determined not to take anything for granted and to work that bit harder for every single vote and to get over the line. Because, you know, although the government is doing very badly and people are looking to us and talking with us about our plans, we're not there yet, and we need to keep fighting for it.
Because Keir reports are that Keir Starmer has asked for shadow ministers to come up with their first 100-day plans. What would you hope to achieve in your first 100 days?
Well, certainly signing off any first 100-day plan is well above my pay grade, so I'm going to be careful about not stepping on toes there. But, you know, I think one thing which is important to set in terms of the context is what we would inherit and the difficulties which we would inherit in terms of the economy, you know, and public finances, and indeed public services more widely. Because, you know, there's a lot of stuff that we would want to do ideally in government, but Keir's been very honest about that and saying, look, a lot of it we're not going to be able to do. We're certainly not going to be able to do a lot of it straight away, because we're going to inherit a mess. You know, we're going to inherit an economy which has had low growth for 13 years, is in a very weak position in terms of debt. We're going to inherit public services which have been stretched to breaking point. We're going to inherit you know, people facing difficulties right across the country, and that will take time to turn around. So I think, you know, what's important for us in the Labour Party is to be clear about our vision, to be clear that we have a vision of a better future with decent jobs across the country, but also be really honest with people that we're not going to get there overnight.
On a practical level, in the tea rooms where colleagues come up to you and say, James, I've got this really exciting prospect for the manifesto, perhaps, or for the Labour's Treasury if we're successful. Do you spend your time just basically having to say no?
I mean, yes, but no. I mean, it's usually I don't want to give too many secrets away, but it's quite often in the lobby where you vote, you know. So the pattern there. When people kind of grab you when you're waiting for those few minutes before you get through the voting, the voting bit. And you know, I mean, it's ultimately not my decision. Again, it's a pay grade or two above mine. But it is something which I always say to colleagues when they start broaching the topic of any commitments. I said, well, look, first, any commitments we make have to be fully costed and fully funded. You know, there is not a chance in any chance at all of something being committed to it hasn't got those basic things in place. We have to be really clear about priorities. But what this means for me, and what I sort of say to colleagues, and you know, I say it in a general sense to them as well, is that we need to be looking at reform as well as just money. You know, it can't be the answer that we just put more money into everything, because people are already, you know, the tax burden in this country is the highest in 70 years. It is not the right thing to do to simply put more money into public services without thinking about reform. And that's really clear in things like the health service, you know, where Wes Streeting has been really clear saying, you know, yes, we need to invest in the NHS workforce, and we've set out our plan to abolish the non-dom tax status and use some of that money to invest in the NHS workforce. But at the same time, Wes is absolutely, you know, focused on reform and how do we make the NHS work better and fit for the future.
So you enjoy ideas that when people come to you that save money or perhaps make money with reform at the heart, and overnight
and do things differently.
And overnight, the Chancellor's given his Mansion House speech, his debut Mansion House speech, which we'll come on to in a sec. At the same time, I think this morning, judgment on Labour's plans for private schools and the application of business rates and VAT. That must be welcome to have independent analysis of some new money coming into the system through those reforms.
Yes, I mean that example of VAT and other tax breaks for private schools is a good example of where we've said, look, if we're going to make any commitments, they've got to be fully costed, you know, and fully funded. And so we're saying any investment we want to make in education that Bridget Phillipson set out, you know, we're going to fund that by scrapping these tax breaks that private schools have. And you know, some of the analysis about that is making clear that the numbers are solid and the excuse me, and it gives extra credence, I think, to the proposals we're putting forward about making sure that this funding would fund this particular investment. But you know, in terms of the Mansion House speech last night, you know, I think in a way some of the mood in the room was very much, well, they've had 13 years, you know, this is, let's look at the detail. But actually, whatever they say, there's a slight sense of I don't know, sort of credibility gap in terms of them actually delivering it. Because firstly, why are they just coming around stuff after so many years? But also, do they have the energy? Do they have the parliamentary majority? Do they have the drive to get anything done? And I think there's a real sense of, you know, them coming to the end of the line.
You strike an important assessment of that, because particularly when thinking about questions to ask you, there is a sort of fatigue with, well, you would say that, wouldn't you, to this government? And it strikes me that the prism with which everything is now seen, that this government attempts to relaunch, there's a risk that people, you know, sort of faith in that, in those bits. But what I would say, and I've got to be a bit independent, we'll go to Uxbridge together after this, but this talk of risk and giving pensions and local authorities and using public money, or the public's money, to sweat it a bit more with higher levels of risk. Where's Labour's position on that? Will we see cross-party view as with greater risk comes greater reward, and so risk will become a factor in our considerations about where we invest and how we invest public money?
So I think you're actually touching on a really, really central point in our vision of the economy, and actually what I think the economy needs overall, which is that, you know, the way I see it is that you've got a huge wall of private capital out there. You've got people from around the world, indeed, who might be considering investing in new jobs and new industries and growth in the UK. But they need some kind of stability. They need some kind of certainty. They need the risk to be at a reasonable level rather than a risk they're not prepared to take. And that's where government should be playing a role. You know, government should be helping to support a particular industrial strategy, to support new industries, to give regulatory certainty, to give that stability, and to essentially de-risk those investments, or make companies feel more confident about making those investments. And I think, you know, if you look at our green prosperity plan, where we've talked about the public investment that we would have there to help the growth industries of the future, whether that's you know, clean energy by 2030, insulating 19 million homes across the country, or all the other parts of that plan. For me, the public investment there is strategic public investment to unlock that wider wall of private investment. And I think that's a really important part of understanding what we're seeking to achieve. You know, it's using the state, using public money in a targeted way to give that certainty, to give that boost and unlock the private sector to really grow the economy at pace.
Okay. What do you think the current problems, or the assessment of the current problems of the financial system? And, you know, I think Lisa Nandy speaks about tilting it towards, or systems and the establishment back towards the good for the public. What's your assessment of the financial system, or what do you think we need to do to improve that, how it works for ordinary people?
Well, I think, you know, this comes down to the public and private sector working with a common mission. And I think one of the things running through, you know, our missions that we've set out, or our industrial strategy that Johnny Reynolds has published, is about the private and public sector working hand in hand. And I think, you know, it's something which has really struck me in the conversations with industry, with businesses over the last few years, that the vast majority of businesses I speak to want a government who's interested, who's engaged, who's making strategic, you know, interventions or investments, but is doing that to unlock the private sector. And I think that's really at the heart of the vision that we're putting forward.
Okay. It's a bit about your portfolio then. Your portfolio means you've been engaged thoroughly on the financial legislation, such as the Financial Services and Markets Bill, the National Insurance Contributions Bill. Can you give us an overview of what you've been doing to lead Labour's position on these bills and hold the government to account? And I'm particularly interested, and I hope our viewers are particularly interested in the divergence, the disagreement, what you're arguing the toss over, really. Not so much, well, we support this, we agree with it, but where's the difference making quality in this between the Labour Party and the government?
Yeah, so just so I don't annoy one of my colleagues, the Financial Services and Markets is actually Tulip Sadi, so just be careful.
Tulip, you're welcome to come and join a future session.
Whereas I get the pleasure of doing the finance bills, and you know, there's quite a lot of finance bills in recent years.
Indeed,
there used to be slightly fewer, but at the moment there seems to be always one coming around the corner. And the thing about a finance bill that I found, I think I'm now into my 4th or 5th finance bill, so you know, I've been through a few times the process of being the lead opposition member on it. You know, they land on your desk and they're about, you know, 2 inches thick. And what's really fascinating about finance bills is that they don't just seek to achieve one thing. You know, it's not one particular change to law in one area. They change tax right across the spectrum of all the different policy areas you could think of. So actually, I feel in a really you know, lucky position that I get to see a bit of policy in every area where tax is relevant. And I think, you know, some of it is very detailed. You know, obviously tax ranges from real minutiae that you have to get your head around the mechanics of, right up to the really big political decisions, which we've talked about in public, the windfall tax, the level of national insurance, which has been up and down in recent years, all the ways that taxes affect working people across the country. And I think, one of the real focuses for me and for the whole Shadow Treasury team in terms of taxation is about making tax fairer. We recognise the tax burden is its highest in 70 years. We also recognise it's unfair. Tax is high on working people. And so we would start by closing down some of those loopholes which make the tax system unfair. I mentioned the non-dom tax status earlier. You mentioned the VAT on private schools. Closing down some of those loopholes to use the money that we would save to invest in public services is a way of using the tax system in a fairer way to support what the public need.
Okay. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, you, when you were a deputy mayor for Sadiq Khan, Labour's London mayor, you were responsible for housing. Question on stamp duty: where does stamp duty fit into your vision? I appreciate you're not in housing, but I won't let you pivot on that one. And not just on housing availability. And Rachel spoke actually at the weekend about housing and the planning system. Clearly a lot of need for younger people, and they're not even that young now, trying to get onto the property ladder. What's your vision for housing, particularly on stamp duty as well?
Well, look, stamp duty was actually debated quite recently in the Commons, where the Conservatives put forward a stamp duty cut, but that would affect all buyers of all homes. It wouldn't be targeted particularly at first-time buyers. We're talking about billions of pounds of public money on that stamp duty cut, so we opposed it. It would have been the easiest thing to do for opposition, just to say yes, fine, let's let it go through. But we're really serious when we talk about spending public money wisely and making priority decisions about where does this money go. So we oppose that change to the stamp duty, to the temporary cut in stamp duty that the government brought in. That was one that actually was introduced by Kwasi Kwarteng, but I think carried over, although they then said it wasn't going to be indefinite, it was going to be time limited under
one of the few things that did survive.
Exactly, yes, one of the few
panic
things.
Unroll,
that's right. So so I think on stamp duty is one where we've got to be clear about making priorities, and I think that's why I think it helps to give people trust in our decision taking, that we're prepared to say no to things which might be easy to agree with or might be popular with some people, but we've got to be hard-nosed about what is a priority and what is affordable. I think really as well the focus on stamp duty shouldn't allow the wider conversation about the housing market to be squeezed out, because actually the Conservatives have scrapped housing targets, which we think is the wrong thing to do. We also think there needs to be more done to help first-time buyers through a comprehensive mortgage insurance scheme, which would help people particularly who are struggling to get that deposit to put down on a first home. And we would also offer first dibs for local first-time buyers on a proportion of new developments. So I think there's a lot more that could be done on housing that we're saying should be done on housing. I remember when I was at City Hall, one of the big issues was, I'm pointing that way, I think it's still that way, isn't it? One of the big issues at City Hall for first-time buyers was deposits. Getting that deposit together, and actually that was one of the really big issues. So I think tackling that is really important.
And I think that Rachel Rees, Shadow Chancellor, was looking at consideration of the rental records as contributing to credit scoring. And I mean, the economic climate we're in demands that sort of creative thinking. I think that would be hugely welcome for renters stuck, unable to buy, that they would actually be qualifying in each monthly rental payment towards or contributing towards qualifying with a credit score. Has that been agreed? Is that going ahead? Do you see that as a part of our manifesto?
Manifesto? So I mean, the issue with renting is quite how much I think renting has changed over the last 10 or 20 years. And actually, my constituency, Ealing North in West London, I think if you look at the censuses, I think it was probably the 2001 to 2011 censuses, so it's probably a little bit out of date now, but it had the biggest change of any borough in London in terms of the increase of private renting. So these are not new homes necessarily. These are homes that were owned by, let's say, families before, owner-occupiers, and are now owned by people who are renting them out, and sometimes subdividing them and then renting them out to multiple households. And I think the role of the private sector has really changed over that time, because rather than being a kind of a temporary tenure where people might be when they're young or whilst briefly saving for a deposit and then buying a home, or in some cases getting a long-term social tenancy. It's now become somewhere where people feel stuck indefinitely, and that's really difficult for people, because the private rented sector regulations are not fit for purpose for long-term living. When you can be evicted with 2 months notice under Section 21, if you've got kids in a local school, that just doesn't work. So the whole regulation of the private rented sector needs to be brought up to scratch to recognise the reality of private renting now. But we also need to make sure that people have an opportunity to buy, because that's what I think the vast majority of people want to do. People want that opportunity. And whilst it used to be the case that you thought you might rent privately for a few years, save up and then buy, we need to make sure that we are bringing regulations, bringing our approach up to the current reality of the situation, so that people still can achieve that dream of home ownership.
And ideas from City Hall, will you take that to the country? Is there any policy ideas or policy thinking that you would want to see a Labour administration bring in, that you oversaw in Sadiq's administration?
So I need to be really careful about stepping on toes. I'm very conscious of that as a shadow minister. I don't want to step on, we've got Matt Pennycook, who's doing a fantastic job at shadow housing. And
Matt, you're welcome to the next one.
I keep name checking people, and you then invited them to the next
one.
So.
Somebody will be noting this down, and we'll be saying, James has just committed you to our next series of questions. Great.
But actually, one thing I would say from City Hall, which is really important, looping back to an earlier point we were making. So when we got into City Hall, we said, look, we want to increase the amount of affordable housing developments, because it was 13% of homes being built in private developments were affordable. We wanted to increase that number. So we worked with industry, we worked with the property development industry, worked with councils, worked with housing associations, and very quickly came up with a plan where we said, look, if you offer 35% affordable housing, which is higher than what we're having now, we'll give you a fast track through the planning system. So that's the deal. You get fast track through the planning system if you provide a slightly higher level of affordable housing. And actually, what was really good about that is it gave developers and housing associations and councils certainty about the system, so that when they were buying land, they could know they were going to have to provide 35% affordable housing, but they knew if they did that, they would get through the planning system quicker. And that kind of idea of certainty, I think, links back to what we were saying earlier about providing that kind of roadmap, providing that kind of confidence that people can say, right, I know what's going to happen in a few years' time, or have reasonable confidence where we're going to be in a few years' time in terms of the regulations, rather than at the moment. And it's like, you've got to check your Twitter at lunchtime to see if it's changed since the morning.
Okay, fine. Isn't the problem beyond that, though, that the notion of affordability itself demands review, right? I mean, the proportion of which your salary qualifies you for borrowing is maybe 4 or 5% as a multiplier, and yet the value of homes, including starter homes in much of the country, are beyond reach for any lender to first-time buyers. How do we reset that system?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not going to be an overnight fix on this. I think housing, even more than almost any other area, is one where it takes a long time to make a difference. But I'd say two things. I think first, when we're talking about affordable housing, like capital A affordable, as in the affordable housing which is funded through programs or planning requirements, one of the most common refrains I had when I was at City Hall is, when I talked about affordable, people would say, well, what do you mean by affordable?
Right.
And the reason they said that,
because in some cases housing benefit isn't even keeping up with
I think the reason
rents in the private sector,
absolutely,
which is relied on to provide the gap, to fill the gap between what's available in public and private.
Exactly. And what we've had in London is very much a case. When I was at City Hall, we were really aware of this, and because of the housing benefit caps, people were moving out from inner London to outer London and outer London and beyond. So that happens. But the other part of this is about the definition, the kind of government definition of affordable. And when the coalition government came in, they redefined affordable housing as 80% of market value. And I think that really damaged, particularly somewhere like London. I realise I'm focusing on London a lot now because that's where I was working on housing. But particularly in London, that definition of affordable, I think, really challenged people's confidence in the term. So when I was then saying affordable, people would look at me and sort of, raise an eyebrow because they didn't know what I meant. So I think bringing some kind of confidence back to what we mean by affordable, genuinely affordable housing, I think. So
might a Labour administration revise the percentage qualification for affordable?
Well, look, again, not going to step on toes, and we'll set our plans ahead of the next general election. But I think it's clear that you need to have confidence in what affordable means, so that you can, if you are particularly putting public money into affordable housing, people know it's going to help people in need. I think the other part of it, though, that's the capital A affordable. In terms of the affordability of housing more widely, I do think a lot of it comes down to the question of deposits. And that's a really important point. And people, particularly when they've got high rents, struggling to get a deposit, deposits as a higher proportion of the overall capital value of the home, that just provides an extra barrier in the way to people buying their first home.
Continuing for a little while longer on the subject of housing, particularly around mortgages, you've been quite outspoken in the concept of mortgage prisoners in the past. What do you mean by that, and how would Labour tackle the problem? It's worth just considering that fixed rate mortgages may reach 7% in the coming weeks, which and I say this as a fixed term mortgage owner from New Year's Day, which I think we fixed it just below 4%, and that felt pretty high.
That's pretty good now.
The idea that it's now going to be up to 7% is extraordinary, and will be causing a lot of alarm for families and households. So it is a housing issue, but it's a wider cost of living point. What's Labour's plans for that?
Yeah, you're right, and it's causing real anxiety and real hardship for families right across the country. And I think so far this year, around 700,000 households have had to remortgage. We've got about another 700,000 are going to be remortgaging this year. So that's like getting up to 1.5 million people, 1.5 million households are affected in this year alone by those changes in mortgage rates. And what we said is people need some kind of confidence that there is a system there to protect them from some of the worst impacts of these rising mortgage rates. Now, it needs to be targeted. It needs to be specific, and there have been some suggestions for much broader sweeping interventions, which we don't agree with. We think it has to be targeted. But what we said there should be is a mandatory guarantee that anyone who wants it can switch to an interest-only mortgage or lengthen the period of their repayment of their mortgage. And that if they want to reverse those changes in the future, they can do so. And by the way, this won't affect your credit score if you do that.
And the reversal point is super important, isn't it? Because if things improve, you shouldn't just be on the hook for the duration of that new term.
Exactly, because if you think about it, if people are going for interest-only mortgages or a longer time period, that will cost them more in the long run. Like it might help them now, but it will cost them more in the long run. Which is why we think actually that approach will be targeted, because if you could avoid doing that, you might well avoid doing that, because you wouldn't want the longer costs in the long run. But there is that safety valve if you really need that help now. But as you say, because those options would cost people more, you need to have that reversal point baked in. And sorry, just to finish, I think the really important point here is it's mandatory, is a guarantee, because I need to know if I or a constituent of mine is in difficulty, that they can call up their bank, and they know this won't affect my credit score. I'm not going to have a fight with them. They're not going to judge me for it. I've got that confidence. And that's why the mandatory element of it is really important.
Does that require legislation, the mandating, or is it just enforcement measures?
It can be instructed through the FCA. So the FCA can implement that. There's been changes to mortgages during COVID, which was done through the Chancellor instructing the FCA, who then made sure that happened. And the government have brought in some kind of voluntary measures, but it doesn't tick the box, because what you need is that mandatory guarantee to give people that certainty that they can pick up their phone to their mortgage company and get those reassurances we've just set out.
I know my rights conversation with the mortgage price. Okay, great. So final question before we come to the floor or take questions online. So don't leave me hanging. When I ask for a question, I expect somebody to ask one, please. So a recent former Conservative Prime Minister, which doesn't narrow it down, but you'll hear me, you'll realise who I'm referring to, famously dismissed the concerns of business with words I'm not going to repeat. It's fair to say, though, or is it fair to say, that Labour is on somewhat a mission to seduce business itself? And you must be inundated, aren't you, with demands for your time, like an audience that we're having here, with businesses eager to hear from yourself and Rachel and Keir on this new partnership that Rachel and Keir have spoken so strongly about. Give us a flavour of what that means in real term. You talked quite a bit about the public and private and mitigating risk, or at least sharing some of the risk and being front-footed as an active government or an active state to bring or release new money and private money into the system. What does it mean beyond that?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, that partnership is at the absolute heart of our approach, working absolutely hand in hand with business as we develop our plans, as we develop our policy. And what I quite often say to people is that, being in opposition is, in a word, rubbish. No, I did not. None of our colleagues came here to be in opposition. We want to be in government. But being in opposition, the one thing in opposition you can do is make sure you're listening to people on the front line, people in industries, people in sectors. Now, I hope that will continue in government, but certainly in opposition, you really have the opportunity to develop policy by listening to people and bluntly, taking good ideas and really making sure that your ideas come from the widest possible range of sources. And that's what I think I found most useful and most positive about my interactions with businesses over the last few years, in that when we've been thinking about these difficult issues which we need to tackle, we've got some ideas, but businesses have loads of ideas, and actually talking it through with lots and lots of businesses, you see common themes coming up, you can see solutions emerging, and it sort of makes me feel that actually businesses out there know the solution to a lot of these problems. They just need a government to listen and then to do it, and that's a position which I hope we're going to be in.
Okay, great. Thank you, James. Right, so questions from the floor. A show of hands. Yes, please. Introduce yourself to James, and I'll repeat your question for those at home.
Thanks, James, and thanks for your comments. They've been really helpful. Simon Marler from EY. Two questions. The first one, you mentioned around certainty in business. I think that's a really important point. So one, to get your thoughts on, would you consider publishing a tax roadmap in your first 100 days in government on things like corporation tax, business rates, etc., just to give businesses that certainty of what might be coming, and maybe sort of 1, 2, 3 years ahead, because that's something that government has not done so far. That'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on. And the second one is around AI. I can't have a meeting without talking about AI, particularly in the use of the tax system. So I know you have responsibilities for HMRC, etc. Some thoughts on that, how you think the potential of it would be really interesting.
So question on for certainty in business, publication of a tax roadmap. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? And on in relation to artificial intelligence and the tax system relevance to artificial intelligence. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, firstly, in terms of a tax roadmap, I mean, Rachel has said that if we got into office, she would immediately have a quick review of business taxation, and then look to publish a roadmap exactly along those lines, where it sets out, over the course of the Parliament, what we would expect to happen to business taxation. And that absolutely fits with the point we've talked about a few times now, about providing that certainty so that businesses know what's coming down the line, they can make investment decisions on those basis, and it really, it really help economic growth by having that certainty. So that's absolutely, part of what we're thinking of doing. In terms of AI, so HMRC is a really interesting part of my brief, in sort of working out the mechanics at HMRC and how you potentially improve it in the future. And there's been a review of making tax digital done by the National Audit Office, and I think the Public Accounts Committee also are looking into it at the moment. And there's clearly been some difficulties with making tax digital in terms of hitting the timetable and getting the efficiencies from it. But I think what we should be looking at is not only to make sure that the plans as they exist are implemented, but also thinking over the hill about what's coming next. Because when making tax digital was first put together, I don't think everyone was talking about AI. And actually, when you look at other countries in terms of their tax systems and the dynamic approach they take, some countries have auto population of data, where it links up, so you don't actually have to try and find pieces of paper from your bank or your employer and fill it in yourself. It all links up in a much more coherent way. I think there are huge opportunities there to make it a much better customer interaction, because we all know how difficult it can be for many people to get through on the phone when they're trying to call HMRC. It would also help with tax avoidance, I think, and make sure the tax gap was closed to a degree, because sometimes tax avoidance is people deliberately avoiding tax, but sometimes it's a mistake that people make. And actually, if you had something which was more automated and was more well connected, you could get around some of those issues too.
Great. Any other questions from? Yes, James, thanks.
Thanks very much. James Dunn from DXC Technology. I've spent most of today trying not to think about AI, so I'm going to stay away from it. So I just have a slightly odd question, but when we talk about fiscal practices and citing the first from the government, what I think we can say we've learned over the last 10, 30, 15 years is that tends to mean stopping long-term public sector investment that doesn't look as critical as it could. So for us, a real concern is the size of public sector's legacy IT estate. It's absolutely massive. So many plans to reinvest in upgrading NHS infrastructure, for example, over the last 10 years, have been delayed because of other priorities. So I'm keen to understand what your thoughts are on that, because if we talk about cybersecurity, if we talk about efficiency, the single biggest risk to the public sector is the legacy estate in government. So welcome your views on that. Whether you loosen the first one.
So a question on legacy IT on the estate and transition to the cloud or upgrading of our digital infrastructure, particularly in public services.
Well, I think particularly in terms of the NHS, I know West Streeting, part of what we were talking about earlier about the reform and the focus on reform. The use of technology in the NHS, I think, is going to be a crucial part of that reform, and making sure that any public money which is spent on the NHS is spent wisely. I think the possibility of technology to improve services across the piece is really important. There was some interesting stuff put out by the Tony Blair Institute recently, about all of the opportunities that AI and technology could have. And I think it's really crucial to that reform package about how can we use technology to move all of that forward. I think in terms of investment more widely, the central investment that we see as being important for the future of the country, but also for economic growth, is our Green Prosperity Plan, which is the money that we would use to have targeted investments to unlock that wall of private capital, to create clean energy, to insulate all the homes across the country that need insulation improvements, and to make sure that we're getting the economy growing. So I think, again, it comes back to that idea of using public sector investment in a targeted way to unlock that wider wall of private capital.
A question from online around digital skills. How would Labour plan to support those who are less digitally skilled when it comes to a cashless society and digitisation of finance?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's a question which comes up for me as a constituency MP as well.
Sure, yeah,
and
definitely.
I speak to a lot of other MPs, and it comes up from them. So this is very much something which is coming from the ground up, as you'd expect. In my area, it's just outside my area, but the high street serves my area. 4 bank branches there, 3 are closed, 1 is closing. They're all closing down. And actually, what we're seeing in some areas now is this idea of banking hubs being created, where you have a hub in sometimes in a post office, or it can be in a community venue. And day one, it's bank. I probably can't name the bank A. Tuesday it's Bank B, Wednesday it's Bank C, so they have different banks on different days to give that advice. Now that kind of thing I think is really interesting, and really a really positive reaction to what we're facing now, because look, a lot of people do bank online. I do all of my banking online. I don't think I've been into a bank in quite a long time, actually. But we need to make sure that for people and businesses who do need to go into banks, they're available. And there's also an aspect here about the viability of high streets, because I think, you've suddenly got all these vacants on high streets because of banks closing down, and people who do go to get cash out are no longer going there. That can really, pull the rug from under a local high street. So I think making sure that, yes, we are, embracing technology and online banking services is absolutely right. But we have to have the other side of the equation in place as well, which is making sure that the in-person cash-based services are there for people who need them.
Is the digital services tax still something the Labour Party is taking into the general election? This attempt to even the playing field between online and on high street operations? So the commitments we've made so far about the digital services tax are temporary, only for the current year and previous years. So that's a sort of time limited commitment about making sure that we help small businesses through difficult times. In the longer run, we said that we would in government, we would scrap the current rate of business rates and replace it with a fairer system, which would incentivize investment, which would shift the burden away from high streets and from small businesses, make sure that online companies are paying their fair share. And the idea there is to make sure that business rates is less of a drag on entrepreneurialism and growth. Because I think at the moment, when you talk to businesses about what's holding them back and the difficulties they face, you very quickly get to business rates as part of the conversation. You would find yourselves moving it further along the kind of profit-making journey into perhaps a corporation tax or a review of corporation tax if business rates have been done away with?
well, we'll set out our detailed plans ahead of the next election. But
A bit of a googly, you did well there. Try and break some news, but that's fine. Okay, well, we've got a few minutes left to take a question. Yes, please. Yes, hi.
What would you say are Labour's top priorities for the growth of the fintech sector and especially challenger banks?
Yeah, but
I'll just repeat for
Yes.
online. The growth of, sorry,
The
the fintech sector, yes, of course,
and
and challenger banks, yes.
yeah.
Thank
No,
you.
it's a really interesting point, and my colleague Tulip Sadiq is leading on this work and doing a lot of work on it. But I was fortunate, there was one meeting I had to cover for her when I got to meet a lot of fintech representatives in London, and it really strikes me that there's a huge potential for growth there. And it actually links this broader point about how do we get growth in the UK, and what's our strategy for growth, which is about focusing on our natural advantages and supporting them. So this applies across the piece to all different sort of industries, whether it's our life sciences, whether it's the particular energy sources we have in the country. But I think fintech is a really exciting one as well, and it's one where we need to have government in a position of offering, I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm not going to apologise for it, some kind of stability and certainty, a path of how we would support fintech in the future.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Scott from NatWest. Just to come back to Mansion House, a number of the things the Chancellor announced yesterday sound very similar to things which Rachel was suggesting when in the US. I'm aware most of the documents only came out about 7 or 8 this morning, so you probably haven't had time to read them. But given that industry values certainty and the knowledge that one government to another may keep some of the ideas of the previous one, do the ideas that came out yesterday seem sensible to you, and would it be something that Labour would be willing to support?
They keep stealing Labour's ideas, don't they, on a number of fronts? Would you agree with Scott's assessment?
In a broad sense, what is it? Imitation is the greatest form of flattery,
Indeed.
and that's the NHS workforce plan. They tried to steal some of that last week. Windfall tax we were calling for since January
In fact,
2022.
the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, when he was chair of the Health Select Committee, endorsed West Streeting's plan. So it's no surprise
He
that
did.
he's taken a version of
I did
it.
mention that a few times in
Yeah, I'm
Parliament,
sure you
actually,
have.
so maybe the Chancellor should have a word with himself about that. But look, these documents have come out this morning, and obviously the wider team will be looking at that. I think there's actually a statement in Parliament which might be relevant, so definitely don't want to step on toes there. But what I will say is, I think right across the piece, the ideas are coming from us. The ideas about what to do in terms of tackling the big challenges of the future, they're coming from the opposition, and that's partly because we're energetic and we want to get into government, but it's partly because we're listening. We're listening to people on the front line, we're listening to businesses, we're listening to industry, we're listening to workers, we're listening to what people are facing in their lives and the solution they have. And if we can take all of that and work with our colleagues in the shadow front bench teams and put forward a compelling policy offer, then I think we're in a strong position ahead of the next election.
So in my opening remarks, I talked about widely seen as the second most senior job in the Treasury. Do you feel like this?
I don't want to over promote it. I think Pat's probably the second.
I was going to say, you and Pat vie for
no, I think Pat's definitely more senior than me, and rightly so. And he's amazing. So he's absolutely fantastic.
Terrific guy. That's great. Okay, we've got about 1 minute left. Oh, Charlie, one of our co-founders, Charlie Napier. Charlie, please fire away.
Thank you, James. Inflation, the Prime Minister perhaps made a bit of a sort of foolish promise at the beginning of the year. So I'm sure Rachel won't be making a similar promise, but you are on the doorstep later this afternoon in Atticus, and someone says to you, my bills are going up, everything's costing. What are you going to do about inflation if you were to come into power next month? What would be your answer?
Yeah. Well, look, firstly, I'd say we can't turn things around overnight. Going to be really straight with people. We're not going to promise stuff which we can't do on day one. But actually, one of the things we would do straight away is get that investment in clean energy sources, and insulation, which would bring down energy bills. Energy bills being one of the highest, one of the key drivers of inflation. So we could bring down energy bills. That would be a big benefit. Get rid of some of the red tape in the Brexit deal, which is impacting on trade, which again is impacting on prices. Make sure the Brexit deal works. That would help bring down inflation. And actually our investment more widely in the Green Prosperity Plan that we've been speaking about today, that is sort of modern supply side economics. So that's actually anti-inflationary if you're investing in the supply side of the economy. So I would be honest with people and say, look, we can't come in on day one, pull a lever that the Tories haven't found. But I would say we've got the plan to deal with this, and actually not just offer sticking plasters, important as it is to get people through the immediate challenges now, which is why the windfall tax was so important for us to bring down energy bills, but also put in place those long-term solutions to try and make life better in the future.
That, can I ask a quick follow-up? That includes public sector pay restricted now?
Well, look, public sector pay is something which should be negotiated, and I think the biggest criticism we have of government is that they've been hands off in the negotiation. You know, they haven't been around the table, they haven't been trying to come to a solution, and they haven't been trying to avoid strikes going ahead in the way that they should have, and they should have taken their responsibility on that.
So would you go around the table? Would you join the public sector pay review conversation?
Well, look, I
Do
mean,
you see that as a responsibility?
well, look, you know, when you've got teachers in the position they are, when you've got, you know, people across the NHS striking, when you've got people in all different sectors threatening, you know, industrial action and sometimes taking industrial action, government has a responsibility to try and find a solution. And I think, you know, the big criticism we've had of the government is that they have been hands off, they've been stepping back, they haven't been taking responsibility, rather than trying to find, you know, a deal which avoids strikes having to go ahead.
Thank you. Great. Well, that concludes our meeting here today. James, you've spoken already about what is planned for the rest of the day. So we really appreciate you fitting us into such a busy time for you, such a busy time for the Labour opposition, as well as all the by-elections that you're having to be
Has Nadine
pulled
resigned yet?
into.
Someone check that.
Yeah, have we hit 5? Yeah. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for
Good luck
having
for
me.
the future. And it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Please let's show our appreciation, James.